Welcome and thank you for stopping by Sheila's Audiobooks, and I am Sheila. This recording is coming from South Texas. All stories on this recording are in the public domain per United States copyright law. These stories were first published around April 1910. They are about Lord Lister called John C. Raffles, the most brilliant among all thieves. He is the terror of usurers and moneylenders, robs them of their possessions by his wiles, protecting beleaguered innocence and supporting the needy. Man of honor in all respects. He persuaded that many abuses, protected by law, continue to proliferate with impunity. Every effort is made to apprehend Lord Lister, called John C. Raffles, the most brilliant of thieves. Reward, £1,000 sterling. Lord Lister, the Bank Director. Chapter 1. An Ancient Knowledge. One evening in February, John Raffles sat with his friend Charlie Brand in one of the boxes of the Garrick Theatre in London to watch the performance. The great stranger had only returned to England a few days ago. He had spent the month of January and the first half of February with his secretary in Paris and practiced his usual sport there too. "It's getting tedious," he said to his friend. "The plays are getting worse year by year, though the actors are better than they used to be, and so is my sport. People have less and less money, but in spite of this the burglars are more trained than before. For some time now I have been planning to say goodbye to London and move to Berlin, for I have heard that the police there must be much smarter than ours here in London. I would like to measure myself against those people." Charlie Brand smiled and spoke. "You praise a Berlin institution at the expense of your own country, and yet I believe that in the field of criminal matters the police have never made themselves as ridiculous as those in the world. I am thinking of a special case here." "To which?" Raffles asked. "To the story of the chieftain of Köpenick." "You are mistaken," replied John Raffles. "The accusation you make of the police is out of place. For nowhere in the world has it been brought so far that one can prevent a crime of which one has not the slightest suspicion. I believe, however, that in Germany a sportsman like me could still achieve great things, and I really have the plan." He stopped suddenly and fixed through his monocle a heavy-set gentleman, who was walking with some ostentatiously dressed ladies of the demi-monde in a side lodge took place. Charlie Brand followed his master's gaze and whispered, "Do you know that gentleman?" "Yes," said John Raffles softly, "I know that man only too well, unfortunately. He is one of those men on whom I wish a strong snare about his neck." "Who is he?" Charlie Brand asked. At this moment Lord Lister rose and left the box. The curtain was raised and the play began. Charlie followed closely behind. They went into the foyer, sat down in easy chairs, ordered whiskey and soda, and smoked cigarettes. "I don't want," said the great stranger, "that man should see me in the theatre, but I shall meet him out here." "Aha," replied Charlie Brand, "so you know him personally?" "To that man I owe my career. In fact, I should be most grateful to him. Because of him I have become a master thief, leading an amusing, curious and profitable life." "What sort of man is that then?" Charlie Brand asked impatiently. "Well, I'll tell you the story," was the reply. Lord Lister blew out thick clouds of smoke and began, "It was about 10 years ago when my father was still alive, received my maternal inheritance, upon my declaration of majority. I was then a member of the Hamilton Club. The other fellow members were all Africans, that is, people who lived and fought in Africa in our colonies. There were not only former soldiers, but also merchants. In this club I met a certain Mr. Nogesh. He came from Pretoria and said he owned several gold mines and a diamond field. After several weeks I became more acquainted with him, and he invited me to dine at his home in West End House, furnished with exquisite opulence, which I entered. When I had taken my seat in an easy chair, I did not know that I would leave that house a completely different person. There I met a young lady, who was exceedingly beautiful and set my youthful heart on fire. She was from Johannesburg and claimed to be a niece of Mr. de Beekes. I estimated her to be about 18 years old. Already on the first evening I noticed that she reciprocated my feelings, which I expressed to her openly. Late that evening when I sat smoking a cigarette with the master of the house, he patted me on the shoulder with a jovial smile and said, "Young friend, you have made a good impression on my cousin, as I have noticed. Thou art the first man who apparently has a chance of acquiring her hand and her wealth. I draw your attention to the fact that the young lady is an orphan and that I am her guardian. So I kindly ask you, if you have no serious intentions, not to make the girl run wild." Young ass that I was, I felt how I blushed at those words. The statement that I had impressed the young girl made me embarrassed. I stammered a few insignificant words, said goodbye and went home with a heated head. I tried to calm myself by cold showers and other means, and decided to enter Mr. Gesh and his company. I didn't want to commit myself at such a young age. But only 3 days later, foolish as I was sitting with a beautiful bouquet of orchids in Mr. Gesh and waited with beating heart for his niece to enter. Then everything went according to the normal program. I was so blind that I did not see how the fellow opened all the doors of his house to me, and how he overwhelmed me with his kindness. I was in the family for 4 weeks when one day I heard from Mr. Gesh was invited to an important, confidential meeting. At once I went to him, thinking that he demanded an explanation of my relation to his pupil, and I was ready to accede to all his wishes, to offer the young lady my lordship, my hand, and my wealth. But it turned out differently. Mr. Gesh explained to me that he was about to set up a new large-scale bank in London and that he had given me an honourable position in this company, namely to act as chief executive and to use my name as bank manager. Draw. He told me a royal income that I was to receive, and painted my activities in such seductive colours that I immediately took the bait, and that same afternoon, when our conference took place, signed the contract before a notary. And now the deceit began in a huge way. While I drove or walked in the parks with the pretty cousin and went on trips around London, Mr. Gesh took advantage of my name and succeeded in finding dozens of great capitalists and thousands of people who confidently entrusted their property to him. I, a madman in love, saw or heard nothing. Mr. Gesh had informed me that I could only ask for his pupil's hand in a year's time. We first had to get to know each other sufficiently before we committed ourselves for life. There one day my father died quite unexpectedly. A heart attack had ended his life. I had loved him very much, but felt no sincere sadness, because my thoughts were on the beloved. I was glad when the necessary formalities were over. The fortune my father left me was nearly £4 million, so I was a very good match. Fortunately, I was not one of the impoverished English aristocrats who, in order to refresh their arms, must marry the daughters of American pork butchers or manufacturers of cured meats. Raffles was silent for a few seconds, then lit another cigarette and looked thoughtfully at the disappearing puffs of smoke. Charlie Brand had also become silent. "In short, dear Charlie," continued Raffles, 4 months after my father's death a police commissioner entered my house one morning and declared me a prisoner. I thought I had misunderstood and asked what I was accused of. And now the following was communicated to me by this aged officer, who had been friends with my father. "I am willing to believe, Lord Lister, that you know nothing of all this tampering. And therefore I will not let you be imprisoned, but give you permission to remain in your house, if you give me your word of honor not to leave your quarters. The charge against you is that you, as director of the newly formed bank, have embezzled the assets of your creditors, amounting to £5 million sterling. I exclaimed in horror. Me? In all my life I have never left anyone short of a penny, nor do I need to, as I am wealthy. You know this, sir. I don't understand your charge. Mr. Gesh, the deputy director, told me only yesterday that he had never made such excellent businesses with our bank." The commissioner smiled. "I'd like to believe that. This man has made some truly wonderful things. He made at least £4 million sterling and went on a trip with it last night. I had a feeling as if I had been struck by a bolt of lightning. I thought I was dreaming, fantasizing. That couldn't possibly be true. But it was bitter truth. That same evening, with the help of my lawyer, I succeeded in getting hold of my assets and using this capital to repay the creditors for their deposits. Within a week everything was fine. As soon as the last coins had disappeared from my pocket I closed the office rooms and had to be glad that, thanks to my excellent relations and my good name, I had been able to get out of this dirty business without dishonorable punishment. A trial against the great swindler, Mr. Gesh, was impossible, as all creditors had got theirs back, and I, too, could do nothing against him, as I was his accomplice. Now I'm curious how that fellow, whom I haven't seen in 10 years, will behave towards me. He will be surprised to see me back here." The theatre bell announced the long intermission. The audience immediately poured into the foyers. In the midst of the commotion, Mr. Gesh met the waiting gentleman with his 2 ladies, and Raffles, who had risen with Charlie Brand, caused him to suddenly appear in front of Mr. Gesh stood. The villain's plump, puffy face paled as suddenly Lord Lister, surnamed Raffles, stood before him. Immediately, however, he recovered himself and, leaving the 2 ladies to stand, held out both hands to Raffles and cried, in a voice apparently trembling with joy, "That's a joy, my dear Lord Lister, to see you again at last." Charlie Brand was amazed when Raffles, with an equally sweet smile, rushed to meet the man, pressed his hands cordially, and answered, "That is a pleasant coincidence indeed. I am very pleased to see you again. You have changed little in all these years." "Neither do you, my dear friend," replied Mr. Gesh with his fat voice. "I should have recognized you among thousands, amiable, elegant, and neat as ever. What did you do during that time?" "More on that later," replied Raffles. "Since when have you been in London?" "For 2 days, dear lord," replied Mr. Gesh. "I intend to settle here permanently, in Brighton. I have much to discuss with you, Lord Lister. I have thought of you continually on my journey to England. I come from Australia, with great desire to make amends at last for what I failed you at the time by failed speculations." Raffles made a slight deflecting movement of his hand and spoke. "Let that rest, that matter is long forgotten. Whether I had lost the money at the gaming table or elsewhere, it comes to the same thing." "No, no," said Mr. Gesh, "that is not indifferent to me, and I have an excellent idea to get everything back in a playful way. I was until now a director of the Lincoln Bank, which I founded in Sydney, and, as you well know, we have had a branch in London for 4 years." Raffles put on a serious face. The Lincoln Bank was known in the city as extremely solid. How was it possible that this man was connected to that cause and even wanted to settle in his own homeland? "I shall henceforth," continued Mr. Gesh, "to run the business of the bank in London. After 6 years of work, the supervisory committee gives me the confidence to appoint me as director. Visit me tomorrow at my hotel. Here's my ticket. I'll wait for you between 10 and 11 o'clock. There is one thing I must draw your attention to," at which the bank manager leaned towards Raffles. "I no longer call myself Gesh, but Stein." Raffles looked at him intently for a moment and replied, "And my name is no longer Lord Lister, but Raffles." Mr. Gesh gasped for air when he heard that name. But before he could say anything, the great unknown shook his hand with a friendly smile and said, "See you again, Mr. Stein, tomorrow at your hotel." "See you again, Mr. Raffles," added Lord Lister, "but it is better that I remain the great unknown to you and to all others. I am sure to be at your hotel tomorrow." He took Charlie Brand's arm and left the theatre. Chapter 2. A roasty proposal. As soon as Raffles had taken his leave, Mr. Gesh joined the ladies on account of a sudden indisposition and, without waiting for the end of the performance, went to his hotel. He lived in the Savoy Hotel and occupied a series of regally decorated rooms there. His valet Mackintosh waited here on him, an Irishman by birth, who took his pelt from him as he entered the room. Mackintosh had a hideous appearance. He might have been about 40 years old, his broad face was marred by smallpox, and a large scar, probably from a saber cut, ran across his forehead. This man was the confidant of Mr. Gesh. He had met him in Australia, and he was less his valet than his accomplice. Banished from England to Australia 20 years ago for robbery and murder, he had fled the penal colony there. Surely he would have fallen back into the hands of the English police had he not found refuge in a small mining company run by Mr. Gesh. When he had taken the fur coat, Mr. Gesh to him, "Come into my study, I have important matters to discuss with you." Together they went to the last of the row of rooms, which had been arranged as a study. "I have," began Mr. Gesh, "seen one again this evening, a former lord, who I suppose bears a burning hatred of me for something that happened 10 years ago. That apparently insignificant young man has meanwhile become a dangerous criminal." "So a colleague," laughed Mackintosh. "Does the fellow want to betray you?" "I'm afraid of it," replied Mr. Gesh, "that the villain will harm me in some way and to avenge himself on me. And that would be our downfall." now that we want to embark on such great things. The devil fetch the dog, said Mackintosh, clenching his great fists. Where is he? I will seek him out and smash his brains in, so that he may lose his desire to betray you forever. We must be very careful with him, replied Mr. Gesh. He is one of the most dangerous and cunning men there is. You make me curious, said Mackintosh. What's his name? It's Raffles. Raffles, repeated Mackintosh, his eyes nearly popping out of their sockets in astonishment. Raffles? Damned. How come you know this master thief? That is a long story, replied Mr. Gesh in an evasive tone, which I shall tell you at length on another occasion. Now let's make a plan how we can get this fellow out of the way without anyone noticing my hand in the game. First of all we need to know where he is, replied Mackintosh. We shall know tomorrow, said Mr. Gesh, for I summoned him to my house about 11 o'clock in the morning. Then we'll have a wonderful opportunity tomorrow to fix that thing up. No, Fel Mr. Gesh exclaims, for I have told you that he must not perceive that I have an enemy. We must devise something very special, something ingenious, to render the boy harmless. For nearly an hour they hatched a plan together. Finally Mackintosh, his great ungainly hands pleased, and exclaimed, "This plan is beautiful. No one lives on that island and we will certainly be able to lure him there." The next morning at 11 o'clock the waiter announced to Mr. Gesh visits a banker, John Govan. First wanted Mr. Gesh didn't receive him because he was expecting Raffles. But as it was a banker who wished to see him, he ordered the waiter to admit the gentleman. An old gentleman of distinguished appearance, who, stricken with gout, used 2 crutches, came with difficulty into the room and looked at Mr. Gesh sharply through his golden spectacles. "Would you like to take a seat?" asked Mr. Gesh. "What do you want from me?" The stranger sat down and coughed. "You probably don't know me anymore, Mr. Stein." Mr. Gesh, or rather Stein, as he now called himself, turned pale and looked searchingly at the unknown gentleman for several seconds. But he could not remember ever meeting the old gentleman. "It is more than 10 years ago," said Mr. Gesh, "that I have left London and abroad. One forgets one's former acquaintances in the long run. What was your name again?" "John Govan," coughed the stranger. "John Govan, broker and banker." Mr. Gesh couldn't, in the best of his mind, remember anyone by that name. But in order not to displease the other, he pretended to the contrary. Sure. We have often met at the fair." "Not that," laughed the stranger, "we never met there." "Is my memory so failing me?" replied Mr. Gesh. "It seems so," said the old man, still smiling. "But I remember," said Mr. Gesh, "that we often did business together." "Oh yes," replied the other, "in rather large companies. Only with this difference, that in those days I had almost no understanding of business." Mr. Gesh became nervous. He did not know where the stranger was going. Who was this stranger? What did he want from him? He therefore decided to put a direct question to his visitor, and said, "Will you tell me what brings you to me?" "You seem to be very forgetful, Mr. Stein," replied the old gentleman with a mocking laugh. "You yourself invited me to this meeting." Mr. Gesh exclaimed with a puzzled look. "Who invited you?" "I?" "Certainly, you yourself," answered Mr. Govan. "Last night at the Garrick Theatre you asked me to meet you at your hotel at 11 o'clock today." "I have been to the Garrick Theatre," replied Mr. Gesh, "but I do not remember speaking to you." "You pay me a great compliment, Mr. Gesh," said the stranger, addressing him by his name. "My disguise must be excellent, if an old business friend, such as you, does not recognize me." Mr. Gesh had risen in astonishment at these words of his visitor and looked at the old gentleman as if he had a ghost before him. Finally, after several seconds, he stammered, "Is it really you, Lord Lister?" "Yes," he laughed. "Lord Edward Lister, called John C. Raffles, the great unknown, does the honor of paying you a visit." "Damn, that's a surprise. Your disguise is brilliant. I would have sworn 10 times that you were not Lord Lister, but indeed the one you pretended to be. You really are, as the newspapers report, a master of genius." "Let us be silent about that," said Raffles, who disliked praise. "Tell me what you want of me." "Before everything, my dear friend," began Mr. Gesh, "allow me to serve lunch for both of us." "Don't bother," replied Raffles. "I never use anything on principle with other people, even with very close acquaintances. The only thing I allow myself is a cigarette." "Thou art a remarkable man," remarked Mr. Geist, "a very remarkable man. Do you suppose that I should set before you something harmful?" Raffles shrugged and said, "Are you presented the preparation of the food?" "Not that," replied Mr. Gesh, "but excuse me, Lord Lister." "John Govan," interrupted Raffles. "Right. Excuse me, Mr. Govan, but that borders on persecution madness." "Wow," laughed Raffles, "that's only a principle that belongs to my sport, and I am able to practice that sport so safely because I never lose sight of the main rule." "And who is?" asked Mr. Gesh with tense attention. "As an old friend, I am happy to confide my secret to you," said Raffles. "This rule reads, always feel threatened." "A very strange maxim," found Mr. Gesh. "At least allow me, Mr. Govan, if I offer you a cigarette." "I must also thank you for that," Raffles declined with a nice smile. "I'm used to my own brand. A very light, excellent cigarette. I'll name you the brand, Gibson Girl. Surely you will allow me to light one of these?" "I even request it," answered Mr. Gesh, and he saw Raffles take a cigarette from a precious gold cigarette case adorned with a magnificent coat of arms composed of diamonds and rubies. "I see you have a fine case," said Mr. Gesh. "That must be very expensive." "A souvenir of my meeting with the Russian Grand Duke in Monte Carlo." "A gift?" asked Mr. Gesh with a mocking smile. "No," said Raffles, "that would be contrary to my profession as a sportsman. I never buy anything and never allow myself to be given anything as a gift. In my sport such things are superfluous. All possible rarities come into my hands." "A wonderful profession that you do," replied Mr. Gesh, and for the first time some doubt occurred to him whether he would ever succeed in trapping this master thief. "My time is limited," said Raffles. "I beg you to join me in what you meant last night." "Good," said Mr. Gesh, as he sat down in an armchair opposite Raffles. He also lit a cigarette and, after smoking in silence for a few moments, began. "You know the Lincoln Bank?" "So far only from the outside," Raffles jested, "but it may be that now that you have brought it to my attention, I may take a look inside the bank and the contents of its safes. But I'm afraid my visit will hardly pay off, now that I know you are director." "You are mistaken," replied Mr. Gesh. "The Lincoln Bank is chiefly the savings bank of petty merchants and poor people. We own nearly £3 million of bar, which are kept in our safes. So a visit would be well worth it, and in this sense of the word, to put it succinctly, I propose that you recover from these deposits part of your lost capital." At these words, Raffles looked with half-closed eyes at Mr. Gesh. His features seemed to betray great indifference, but Mr. Gesh would not have uttered another word if he could have guessed the thoughts of his adversary. "The devil take you," Raffles thought to himself. "That fellow seems to have not finished his rogue ways of robbing little folks of their savings. A dangerous subject." Meanwhile he replied in a friendly tone, "For the devil, Mr. Gesh, that would be a blessing if I finally got some of my money back. I can use it so well." "Me too," said Mr. G smiling. "And that is precisely the purpose of my coming to London. I have lost a great deal of money in a speculation, and hope to get it back. I think that if we are honest with each other we can make a few millions playing games." Raffles smoked and replied, "You will certainly not doubt my honesty. Tell me the plan you have. For me there are no obstacles in the exercise of sports." "Then listen," said Mr. Gesh. "I will appoint you as the bank's chief executive in 14 days after I have taken over the management of the bank. As such you hold the keys to the treasury. In a short time, one night, with the keys to the bank, you will open the safes and make off with all the contents, i.e., you will drive in my car with the money to my villa in Brighton, where I will wait for you. Guard. Then we share the spoils. I will then hide you in my villa until the police have calmed down. I myself, however, remain at my post and conduct the affairs of the bank as its director. Isn't that an excellent idea?" "A wonderful plan," replied Raffles fervently, leaping to his feet. "Here is my hand, we will carry it out together." "Bravo," laughed Mr. Gesh, giving Raffles a friendly handshake, "and now we want to seal the deal with a bottle of wine." "I'm sorry," said Raffles, "I'm not taking part in that." "All right," replied Mr. Gesh, "as you please. But first of all you must give me your address. I must be able to send you a message when the time comes." "That is, John Govan, 13 Regent Park," replied Raffles. "It is my paternal house, but no one knows I live there." When the visitor had disappeared, Mr. Gesh his hands and was extremely satisfied. "Well, my dear lord," he said to himself, "at least I've got you now. If Mackintosh kills you, so much the better, then this man of honor as procurator will steal the funds for me. However, if Mackintosh dies in this affair, then I'll be glad to be rid of him at last, and Raffles will hand the deposits into my hands. Two birds with one stone." Chapter 3. The Volcano Island. 2 days after this conference, Raffles received in the morning mail a letter of the following contents. "Dear Sir, I don't know anyone in the world who could help me but you. I am an orphan. I never knew my mother. My father was a merchant and ship owner in Trinidad. 2 years ago today, before I came of age, my father died of a stroke, leaving no will. As I had no relatives, nor anyone in my confidence, I, through a lawyer appointed by the court, settled my father's estate, and found therein, among other things, besides some thousands of pounds sterling, of which I have to this day live, a map, of which I send you an exact sketch. On the reverse side of that card my father noted that a disloyal clerk named Pelugro had stolen from him a fortune of 4 million, which he allegedly fled with about 4 years ago. My father has followed the trail of this man and has learned that he hid a treasure on an unknown island and went to Paris with part of the money. He would have hidden the money right there, lest, should he be captured in Paris, it should fall into my father's hands. Only after my father died would he go and fetch the treasure. Pelugro has died in the meantime. They wanted to arrest him in Paris, and during the fight he had there with the detectives pursuing him, he was killed by a shot. All they found on him were 100,000 francs and the map of the unknown island. So far I have not succeeded in inventing this island. I am now without money, and as I have so often read about you in the papers and heard that you are a generous man, I now turn to you and beg you to help me. I live temporarily in a London boarding house. In the meantime, I remain with the highest respect. Melanie Hope. Raffles read the letter carefully several times. Then he laughed aloud and said to Brand, "That is a very curious thing, which was sent to me there by the post. They seem to be confusing me with Sherlock Holmes. I have to go find a treasure of about 4 million on an unknown island. It's nonsensical." He read through the letter once more to find out the address of the sender, but in vain. There was no indication whatsoever regarding the place of residence of the sender. "Real women's work," said Raffles. "I have to help her, but I don't even know where she lives." He took the accompanying card and examined it. "A strange chaos," he continued to Charlie Brand. "The island looks like a great lobster, and I doubt very much that the thing exists. Besides, I have never heard that an island like this, on which a small volcano is marked, has coral reefs. Look at that map." Charlie Brand studied her with great attention, shook her head, and said, "I think we may get information from the Lloyd where such an island may be found. There they have the best and newest maps in the whole world." "I was already thinking about that. We can try." They went to the Lloyd's office, and the officials of the largest shipping company in the world consulted charts for hours. Already they wanted to give up their attempts when they found an old map, which may have been from the 16th century. They also compared this with the map Raffles had brought with him. Both showed striking similarities, but the coral reefs, which appeared on Raffles's map, were missing from the others. The Lloyd's officer, however, declared it very probable that it must have been an error on the part of the drafters of the chart, which Raffles possessed, since the reefs in question were not coral banks, but sand or stone heights. The island was called Rocky Island and was located close to the western coast of Iceland. "You can reach the island in 4 days by steamer," said the official. "You will find in Southampton, as far as I can find in the ship's lists, a boat called Herta, which sails to Iceland as early as tomorrow. It is a whaling ship. You will not find many comforts on board." When Raffles had left the Society building, he went with Charlie Brand to a large restaurant, where he had his dinner in silence. After the meal was over, he said, smoking a cigarette, "I will sail to Iceland and try to find the island and the treasure." "I advise against it," replied Charlie Brand. "Who knows if the island which has been pointed out to us in Lloyd's office is the same one you seek?" "That doesn't matter," Raffles answered him. "Then I consider my sailing as a pleasure trip. Tomorrow we go from Southampton to Iceland." On the boat that took them to their destination, there was another passenger besides the two of them, and that was Mackintosh. He pretended to be a whaler, and Raffles did not suspect that he had sent the letter to lure him from London to the lonely island and kill him. During the crossing, Mackintosh not the slightest effort to get acquainted with Raffles. Mackintosh had known from earlier days, when he had made several sea voyages, the small island off the west coast of Iceland, and knew that it was seldom visited by men. On arrival at the port of Iceland he disappeared without a trace, and Raffles made an effort to find a fisherman who would take him to the unknown island. First, after he has been for 2 days had sought, he succeeded, and after a voyage which lasted 24 hours, the fishing boat brought him to the small, inhospitable island. In the harbor surrounded by reefs, the two friends found a boat. The owner of the fishing vessel was very surprised at this. He had not thought that there were people on the island. Raffles ordered him to wait with his boat for 3 days in the small rocky harbor. "Be careful," said the fisherman to Raffles, as he brought him ashore. "This island is full of dangerous places. I brought a party of Germans and English to the north of the island last year, and to this day none of them have returned. They will have died in the swamps or in the hot sulfur springs. We always say that this land devours men, and we call Iceland the beginning of hell. So be careful, gentlemen. The soil is volcanic." Raffles thanked the kind old man and went ashore. He and Charlie Brand had furnished themselves with woolen blankets, pickaxes, ropes, and provisions to last them a few days on the island. It was a wild, rocky region through which they traversed. Only with difficulty could they advance. Rocks, icebergs, and precipices barred their way. Despite all this, Raffles followed the direction closely to the place marked on his map as the hiding place of the treasure. In the evening they prepared their bed in a small cave, and Raffles prepared a strong glass of grog on a spirit device he had brought with him. "We are in strange circumstances," said Raffles. "A bit uncomfortable to sleep, but otherwise I think the air here is better than in our foggy London, and one needn't be afraid to meet an Inspector Baxter here." "You are right," laughed Charlie Brand. "I think we are the only living things on the island." They had been resting for several hours, when Charlie, who was lying at the back of the cave, unable to sleep because of the uneasy position and the extraordinary circumstances, heard a sound which made him look attentively at the mouth of the cave. Clearly in the darkness of the night he made out the figure of a man standing in the entrance, evidently listening. Although Charlie was not frightened, he was now trembling with fear. The stranger stooped and slowly crept towards them. The blood congealed in the young man's veins, his throat was constricted and he could not utter a word in horror. He wanted to scream, but he couldn't. He wanted to make a movement to wake Raffles, who was sleeping peacefully beside him, but he couldn't move and couldn't make a sound. His tongue was as if paralyzed, and with only his eyes he followed every movement of the man who had appeared so uncalled. It was clear to Charlie Brand that he was up to no good, nor did he doubt for a moment that he and Lord Lister must act together against this villain if they were to render him harmless. How startled, however, when the stranger came suddenly close to the great unknown, and raised his hand in which he held a dagger aimed at the breast of the quietly sleeping man. The sharp weapon gleamed in the soft moonlight. There Charlie, at the last moment, succeeded in uttering a loud shriek and shaking Raffles' right arm from side to side. Instantly Lord Lister sprang up, armed Browning revolver in hand. "What is?" he exclaimed in surprise. It took Charlie a few minutes to recover from his shock. Then, in short, broken words, he related what he had seen. Raffles laughed at him and thought that everything had been a dream, a delusion. When, however, his young friend firmly stated that he could not have been mistaken, and that he had seen the assassin close at hand, Raffles grew serious and began to search the whole hole carefully. However, no trace of the stranger was discovered. Lord Lister and Charlie also searched the vicinity of their camp, but found nothing suspicious. There was no trace of any living being anywhere. Rocks of erratic shape were scattered all around them, offering safe hiding places for several attackers. The two friends stayed awake for the remainder of the night, discussing the London affair with Mr. Gesh. In the morning they set out again, and Raffles sought with every step they took if he might find any trace of the unknown visitor of the previous night. But no footprints were left in the rocky ground. By evening the two walkers had come within a few hours of their destination. But the rapidly falling darkness made it impossible for them to continue. Under a protruding boulder, Raffles and Charlie Brand lay down, wrapped in their blankets, having agreed to take turns watching. It was almost midnight, and Charlie was about to wake his friend, when two strong arms seized him from behind and his throat was squeezed so tight that he could not utter a sound. As if he were a feather, he was lifted with his blanket and carried away by someone he could not see. It was Intosh, who had found his victims. In vain the young man tried to free himself from the arms of his enemy. The man who carried him away must have enormous powers. For without any effort, and without putting down his heavy burden for a moment, he carried it several hundred yards. Charlie Brand finally gave up trying to free herself. All kinds of thoughts flew through his brain. It was inexplicable to him what interest this strong man could place in him. And that not only he would be rendered harmless, an indeterminate premonition told him. But why all this? Why? He saw no chance to warn Raffles of the unknown fate that awaited him. He clearly saw that his friend, whom he so dearly revered, would become the sacrifice of some rogue who would kill himself first. He saw how this man, whose arms held him as in iron screws, would sneak up to Raffles' couch and thrust the cold steel into the chest of the quietly sleeping young man. These and similar thoughts flew through his brain with lightning speed, without Charlie being able to find a way to save his friend. Suddenly the man who carried him, whom he could not see, stopped and let his load slide to the bottom. Charlie Brand unwrapped himself from his blanket and turned around quickly. But his invisible friend was stronger than him. The moment Charlie breathed in the cool night wind and thrust his head out of the blanket, a strong fist seized his neck from behind and pressed his head down. Then an arm encircled his body and lifted him high. And now Charlie Brand saw before his terrified eyes an abyss from which rose white fumes. With a devilish laugh his unknown foe held him in this dreadful position for some minutes. The poor boy experienced terrible moments as he floated above the abyss. And there was no way to escape the fists of his adversary, there was no way out, no chance of salvation. Although Charlie Brand knew that his last hour had come, he never lost his presence of mind for a moment. Once more he looked about him, as if he wanted to remember exactly the place where he would find his death. It was a wild, romantic area where the two men found themselves. All around them boulders lifted their bald crowns. Right below them, 100 yards deep, lay volcanic lakes, whose black, smooth waters looked like ghostly eyes up to the night sky and the moon. Just before Charlie a curious white fumes rose, the source of which he at first did not understand, until it occurred to him that this hissing vapor was caused by hot subterranean springs. Now he also knew what terrible fate awaited him. That no one could help him once he was down there, he understood very well. Because never before had the rock gorges formed by the volcanoes of Iceland been explored. Now the unknown man released his victim, and with a terrible piercing shriek, which was echoed 1,000 times by the sheer rock walls, Charlie Brand fell into the almost bottomless abyss. A scornful laughter from the criminal was the only answer to the death cry of the young man. Then, like a gigantic panther, he crept back to the couch, to make Raffles take the same path of his first victim. But it happened differently. The cry of horror from Charlie Brand had awakened Raffles. Immediately he had jumped up and noticed that the place where Charlie Brand had lain was empty. While he was still thinking about the mysterious power that had caused his friend to disappear, he saw the figure of a man suddenly appear before him in the darkness of the night. Before Raffles could pick up his revolver, the man lunged like a tiger and grabbed him by the throat. A terrible battle began. Not a sound was heard, except the impetuous panting of the two men, who fought each other to the death. Each of them knew this and redoubled their efforts to win the match. Macintosh had underestimated Raffles' strength. Although this one was also slightly smaller than Intosh, and though he had little physical strength, Raffles was a well-trained wrestler, and nimble as an eel. While Macintosh fought rough, the other defended himself with all the tricks that trained sportsmen are adept at. Failing to overwhelm Raffles, the Irishman, with a quick flick of his hand, tried to draw a dagger from his trouser pocket to thrust it between the ribs of the great stranger. But this attempt was fatal to him. No sooner had his hand released Raffles than the latter seized the opportunity and delivered a mighty blow to his opponent's temple. Like a felled tree trunk, the villain fell unconscious without a sound. Now it was Raffles' work of a few seconds to bind the dangerous fellow with the ropes he had brought with him. After a short time, Macintosh awoke, Gritting his teeth with rage from his stupor, he saw himself in Raffles' power. He had taken out his electric flashlight and let the light fall on the scornful face of the murderer. "Cursed dog!" snapped at the handcuffed one. Raffles had lit a cigarette and was blowing smoke in the cursing man's face. He recognized the pretend whaler who had come here with them from England on the same boat. "Your swearing is ridiculous," said Raffles. "Keep your mouth shut or you will get another blow. When it is day, we will speak more closely." With these words he drew himself close to the prisoner, put the revolver beside him under his reach, and listened with tense attention to every sound that entered his ears. But nothing broke the night's silence. Mackintosh had stopped cursing when he saw that his enemy would not be offended by him. He bit his lips in impotent rage. How gladly would he have helped his hated adversary into eternity with a single stab. This, however, was utterly impossible for him, and he pondered what punishment would await him. Although he did not fear death, he felt little desire to lose his life here. He knew in advance that the punishment that would befall him would be cruel. He had heard and read so much about the great unknown, and his great sense of justice had always managed to punish the guilty. With anger in his heart, the giant surrendered to his fate. In any case, he was certain that if he should ever be free again, or if he should succeed in freeing himself from the fists and chains of Lord Lister, he would start a new life, but would first turn bloody. Revenge on his mortal enemy. With feverish impatience, Raffles awaited the break of day, and as soon as the first ray of the sun illuminated the rocks of the island, he left the resting place and crawled like an Indian, following a certain track, over the stony bottom. With incomprehensible certainty he found the road by which Charlie Brand had been dragged away in the night. Fluff and threads of wool from the blanket in which Charlie had been wrapped and carried away, and which had caught here and there on the rocks, led him, after an hour's search, to the rock from whose top Mackintosh had thrown Charlie down. At the foot of this rock was a funnel-shaped gorge formed by a volcano. Hot vapors rose from it in the air. They prevented Raffles from looking down into the chasm as he knelt and leaned over the edge of the precipice. As if by intuition, he understood that Charlie must be in this cleft, under the protruding rocks. He put his hands over his mouth like a funnel, that the sound might be amplified, and he cried, "Charlie, Charlie." "Hello," came the return, and so close that Raffles was surprised. "Where are you, Charlie?" cried Raffles again. "At most 2 meters from you," replied Charlie Brand. "The chasm narrows down here, so that the opening is only a hand's breadth, which you certainly cannot see up there. I lie here as in a Roman steam bath. I've already tried to climb up, but the rock walls are too slippery and I can't get a foothold." "Wait a minute, I'll help you." Raffles took off his coat and made it into a thick cord. This he then let down. After searching in vain in the midst of the mist for where Charlie might be, he suddenly perceived the lowered coat being pulled, and Charlie Brand called out, "I hold on. Pull me up." Slowly, little by little, Raffles pulled his friend out of the steam and, wet as a cat, emerged. "I believe," laughed Charlie Brand, "that I shall not need a hot bath for the rest of my life." "Did you hurt yourself?" Charlie rubbed his knees and elbows. "Almost broke my neck. The villain threw me head down into the abyss and I thought I would fall in 1,000 pieces. But with a somersault, I turned round just before I reached the cliff face, and only scratched my skin on the knees and elbows. Thank heaven, Charlie, that history has turned out so well again. This time it was only a hair, and now I advise you to quickly return to our sleeping place, so that you can provide yourself with dry clothes. The villain who threw you down I have tied up, and you can, if you like, let him enjoy the hot bath that was meant for you." Mackintosh glared at Raffles as he arrived with Charlie Brand. "The devil take you," he hissed. "You have lost your game," said Raffles. "However, it interests me greatly why you have made this attack upon us." "Go to hell," cursed Mackintosh, "I'm not answering you." Raffles made a fire from dry branches and wood, so that Charlie could warm himself and dry his clothes. Then he made breakfast, and, after the reunited friends had eaten properly, and Charlie Brand had dressed up as best she could, Raffles spoke. "Now we shall go and search for the place where the treasure is, and leave the villain bound here for the time being." "Perhaps the fellow will flee and attack us again," said Charlie. "That would be bad for him," laughed Raffles. "Let us go now." After a 2-hour walk, they found themselves at the spot marked on the map. The great stone was actually there, and at once they discovered fresh traces indicating that someone had tried to take the treasure. With his pickaxe, Raffles worked the ground, and after a short while he came upon a wooden box, which he shattered with a blow. However, it contained an iron box, which was fitted with heavy locks. "We have the treasure, and if I am not very mistaken, the man who attacked us knows our secret. He wanted to get rid of us to get the treasure alone. We will take the cassette unopened to the ship." Raffles tied ropes round the iron box, and as it was too heavy to bear, they both dragged it behind them like a sledge. When Macintosh Raffles discovered with his loot, he roared with rage like a madman and tried violently to break his bonds. Raffles had indeed discovered his treasure. Macintosh had been so frivolous as to carefully copy his map, which he sent to Raffles in order to lure him away from London. For decades, on this remote island, he had secured his loot, everything he had stolen and obtained through murder. His aim had been to take his treasure to London and live there on the millions contained in the iron box. "I see," laughed Raffles, "that we have found your piggy bank. You can rest easy, my friend. I will make good use of the contents." "What shall we do with the man?" Charlie Brand asked. "He deserved a bullet through the brain." "My dear boy," replied Raffles, "I think shooting is a useless invention. First, it costs cartridges, second, it pops and tickles the nerves, and third, it's aimless. One can deal with one's friends in a different way. We shall leave this gentleman here by his empty safe. That will be a greater punishment for him than if we helped him to the other world. Come on, we're going back to our boat." They took no further notice of MC Intosh, who roared with rage, but dragged the cassette behind him. For hours they heard the terrible screams of the abandoned man amidst the rocks. Without further adventures they reached the beach the next day and, with the help of the fishermen, brought the treasure they had found on board the ship. Chapter 4. Raffles become procuration holder. Nearly a week had passed when Raffles returned to London with Charlie Brand. The first thing the great stranger did was to break open the iron box, in which he found, besides a thick bundle of banknotes of great value, heavy bars of molten gold. Thereupon he again made use of the disguise which he had worn when he visited Mr. Gesh and made his way to him. With a queer smile, and with a face that clearly betrayed that he had not expected Raffles, the bank manager received Mr. Gesh, or rather Mr. Steinham. "I am very glad to see you, my dear friend. I was already worried that something might have happened to you. Take your seat, my dear lord. Where have you been so long?" "I was on a journey," replied Raffles slowly, looking sharply at Mr. Gesh. "Traveling? Where to?" "Iceland," replied Raffles, noticing that the other was startled by this answer. This aroused suspicion in Raffles that Mr. Gesh might be somehow connected to the Icelandic case. "What were you doing in Iceland?" asked Mr. Gesh, in a seemingly indifferent tone. "Isn't it an island, forsaken by God and all men?" "No," said Raffles, "God and men are also to be found in Iceland, and the island has an advantage. There is a fresh wind there, there are no detectives and hardly any criminals either. There are no courts or prisons. As far as the latter is concerned, an ideal country for someone who likes peace and quiet. If I hadn't been needed here, I would have stayed longer in Iceland." "You jest, Mr. Gesh. I'm glad you're back. Something could have happened to you. It is a volcanic and dangerous country." "Oh no," laughed Raffles, "things don't happen so easily to me, because I'm always careful. If I had been so before, I still possessed my lost money, which you used in your bank. I should now be the Honourable Lord Lister, like my father, a friend of the king. But first I had to learn to watch, and because I did this diligently with care, I became Raffles." "Don't mention that name," said Mr. Gesh. "I have read so much from you abroad that I always get goosebumps when I hear it." "Remarkable," laughed Raffles, lighting a cigarette. "I heard the same thing from several people." "What?" asked Mr. Gesh. "That they may get goosebumps," replied Raffles. "I thought you had no more skin." "Let's be serious," said Mr. Gesh nervously. "Let us talk about the splendid cause we have together." "I am full of fire," exclaimed Raffles. At these words an imperceptible smile slid across his face. "Yes," said Mr. Gesh with a grin, "it is a wonderful business and promises a wonderful result. In a playful way you will be able to take the millions for us from the safes of the bank. It will cost you no trouble at all." "Pity," interrupted Raffles, "it is the dangers that make me love my sport. An easy job leaves me cold. Unfortunately I can offer you nothing else, said Mr. Gesh, and that we may agree, I beseech you to come to me early tomorrow, I will then inform you of your work. A strange story, said Raffles. I believe such a position is seldom offered to anyone. A wonderful thing, called Mr. Gesh laughs, who will fill our pockets to the brim. I have already succeeded, in the week in which I took up my position at the bank, in obtaining 1,000,000 new deposits by promising the people a higher interest rate. Ha ha ha. He laughed harshly, patting Raffles confidentially on the shoulder with his thug's hand. The high rate of interest, my dear, is the candlelight in which the capitalists fly like moths. Long live the high rate of interest. Raffles joined in the laughter, and after the two men had exchanged a few more words, the great stranger took his leave. The following morning, Mr. recommended him as chief clerk of the Lincoln Bank, giving him the most responsible office to be held at the bank. Raffles, under the name of John Govan, had become Lincoln Bank's first chief clerk. All the business passed through his hands. The checks he signed represented millions. He kept the keys to the safes, which contained millions of cash. Raffles performed his duties with a diligence and punctuality, as if he had been a cashier all his life. Mr. Gesh was very surprised at the activity of the new Attorney General. Rarely did Raffles leave his room when the bank was closed. He almost always stayed an hour longer to work. This fell to Mr. Gesh, and he therefore asked Raffles what he still had to do in his office after closing. Lord Lister replied, I am doing it so that the officers will remember this later and consider me the suspect. I do not understand your train of thought, replied Mr. Gesh. You are a newcomer to my trade, laughed Raffles. I heard today that people distrust me because of my late work. Everyone thinks I'm busy forging the books, or embezzling money. Right, said Mr. Gesh. I would have had the same thought if you had really been my attorney. Satisfied, he left Raffles. But he would not have gone this way if he had seen Raffles use his extra hours to write down from the books of the bank the names of the depositors with their addresses in a notebook, and also to note the amount owed to them. They were mostly petty merchants or widows and orphans who had deposited a small amount of capital. But precisely these savings were worth more to those people than to the big capitalists their millions. The existence and happiness of an entire family depended on almost all these little capitals, and Raffles had to steal them all. Mr. Gesh had rented a lavishly decorated villa near London, where he threw dazzling parties almost every night. He loved to shine through great opulence, and the object of his invitations to participate in his feasts was chiefly to win over capitalists to his cause over a glass of champagne. Raffles had been thinking so far. It was night, almost morning already. Mr. Gesh had gone to sleep when a man crept into his bedroom and roused the bank manager, who was already dozing, by calling his name loudly. Drunk in sleep, Mr. Gesh sat up in his bed and stared about him. In the next moment he recognized the man who stood before him. It was Mackintosh. Is it you, or is it your ghost? Asked Mr. Gesh, looking at his visitor in surprise. It is I myself, replied Mackintosh. Cursed. It was hard work to get back to London. I already considered you lost, said Mr. Gesh. What happened to you? A bloody history with Raffles, replied Mackintosh, gritting his teeth. There, look, he cried, letting Mr. Gesh, as he rolled up his sleeves, saw his bloodshot, swollen wrists. How did that happen? Asked Mr. Gesh. From the shackles that Raffles, has put on me. Did he handcuff you? How was that possible? May the devil take him, replied Mackintosh, clenching his fists. I suspected at once that I was no match for that master thief. That guy is handy and crafty. We can't get to that. That surprises me, said Mr. Gesh. You have a clear head and you are quite familiar to walk alone too. How could Raffles overwhelm you? Accursed! Cried Mackintosh explains. I had made my plan very well and was on the lonely island a day before Raffles and his friend. I spied them as they arrived, and on the second night crept to their sleeping place to cast them both into one of the infernal clefts of the rock, as there are several on the island. I had, I thought, rendered harmless the youthful friend of the snatch thief forever. Accursed! I had no idea that the shriek the fellow gave when I threw him off the cliff would be heard by Raffles. As I slunk back to their encampment, the other was waiting for me, and in the single combat between us I drew the short straw. He knocked me down and handcuffed me. "An unfortunate story," said Mr. Gesh. "How did you manage to free yourself?" "That was very difficult," replied Mackintosh. "Raffles succeeded in hoisting his friend up from the abyss. He hadn't hurt himself at all. One can never know how deep such gaps are between the rocks. Hot fumes prevent you from looking down. In short, Raffles left me handcuffed on the island." "And how did you manage to break those shackles?" "It was impossible to break, they were sturdy English ship's ropes. But he had kindled a small fire, and from it I took out a burning piece of wood with my teeth. With my handcuffed hands I lay down on the piece of wood in such a way that the ropes scorched through. But at the same time I also burned a large part of my hand. I had to endure excruciating pain. But I endured everything to be able to come back among men again, for on that island forsaken by God a human being seldom comes. I had to wait almost a week before I could take the little boat back to the mainland, because a violent storm made the sea turbulent and would certainly have helped me to the other world in my wrecked craft. But now I am here again, and now even the devil can no longer protect Raffles. I will avenge myself." Mr. Gesh had listened attentively to the story and now spoke. "I had already given up hope of seeing you again, so I arranged with Raffles to steal the millions from our safes for us." "That is boundless stupidity," Mackintosh exclaims in surprise. "Now you have brought in the Trojan horse. He will steal the millions, but for himself." "I shall not lose sight of him," assured Mr. Gesh. "It will be difficult for him to deceive us." Mackintosh laughed out loud and clapped his hands on his knees. "Why are you laughing?" asked Mr. Gesh. "Did I give a reason for this?" "Of course," laughed the other. "I amuse myself at your self-righteousness, which makes you believe you are equal to Raffles." "I'll get the job done with him," replied Mr. Gesh, "and I beg you not to spoil everything for me. Now go to your room to rest. We will speak further tomorrow." "What did you say to the servants concerning my journey?" asked Mackintosh, already standing on the threshold. "I told you went to Paris," came the reply. When Mackintosh was in his room, he clenched his fists in anger and exclaimed, "I will not be fooled by Raffles. He has a dangerous enemy in me. I'll send word to Inspector Baxter so he knows what rare bird has lodged in the Lincoln Bank. Already tomorrow the cunning thief will be in Scotland Yard, and I shall be the one who has handed the villainous villain over to the police." Satisfied, Mackintosh on his bed, and a spiteful grin disfigured his face. Chapter 5. The Betrayal. Detective Mahome laughed at his boss, Detective Inspector Baxter, until tears ran down his cheeks. His boss stood in front of him with a letter in hand and glared at his secretary. "Stop laughing at last," exclaimed Baxter. "If anyone comes in here, he must think this is a madhouse. It's police headquarters here." I know," replied Mahome, still laughing, "but it also seems more like madness than a police case." Inspector Baxter paced the desk repeatedly excitedly, then stopped in front of Mahome and said, "So you do not believe the contents of this letter? I will read it to you once more." He unfolded the plain piece of notepaper and read. "Police Headquarters, Scotland Yard. Inspector Baxter. I hereby inform you that the Raffles sought by you is Lincoln Bank's chief clerk and intends to rob the bank for millions. Make haste to catch him before he gets away with the loot. A friend." "A decent friend," said Detective Mahome, "a jester, who would ridicule you for all London. Believe me, Inspector, Raffles has so upset you that you will soon mistake the Lord Mayor of London for Raffles. Think about it, it's nonsense. The chief clerk of Lincoln Bank must be a blameless man. Millions pass through his fingers every day and he enjoys the greatest post of confidence in the bank. The man who is given such a position is carefully investigated by the director and the commissioners of the bank, also with regard to his past. I don't think even you would qualify for that job." "You may be right," replied Baxter nervously, smoking his cigar. "Certainly I am right," said Mahome. "I suppose it is Raffles himself who sent you this letter. He has already indulged in such jokes against you several times." "Unfortunately yes," replied Inspector Baxter, and at the thought of the many pranks Raffles had already played him, a sad smile crossed his face. At this moment there was a knock at the door, and after the inspector had called in, a porter entered the room. He brought a letter for Inspector Baxter. "From whom does this letter come?" asked Baxter suspiciously. "It was given to me in the street by a man," replied the porter. What did that man look like? Baxter inquired further. I don't know, said the porter, but I should know him. Very well, said Baxter, I'll take your address and call you if I need you. The porter left, and Baxter opened the letter. After he had scarcely read a few lines, he called out to Mahome. Now I receive a second letter on the same matter. Listen to what they write to me. My dear sir. As for the Lincoln Bank, I think you ignore my warning and let Raffles go about his business. I urge you to act immediately. In an hour the bank will close, and then it will be impossible to capture Raffles. Hurry. A friend. Insolent brutality, exclaimed Detective Mahome. The fellow has probably already informed all the London papers of our raid on the Lincoln Bank, and tonight all the world would know how ridiculous we have made ourselves. Baxter gave Detective Mahome a nervous look and replied. I appreciate your insight, Mahome, and must confess I feel the same way. But if the author of the letter were right, and Raffles really intended to steal the millions from the Lincoln Bank, it would be irresponsible of us if he succeeded in the theft. In that case, too, we would have been taken by the nose. You are really nervous, Inspector, came Mahome's mouth, calmly filling a pipe. Unfortunately, as I cannot give you any orders, I only kindly ask you not to take me to the Lincoln Bank. I have little desire to make a fool of myself in front of the whole world. I shall act prudently, replied Baxter, and take the letter first to the bank manager for confidential inspection. Do what you can't resist, growled Mahome impatiently. Half an hour later, Inspector Baxter was in Mr. Gesh in the Lincoln Bank building. As Gesh read the letters which the inspector handed him, he paled for a moment, without Baxter noticing. Then he laughed heartily and exclaimed. They tried to make fun of you there, my Lord Inspector. The attorney of our bank, Mr. John Govan, is a most respectable man. If you wish, I will have him come here that you may personally convince yourself. Baxter thanked him for that and said, I beg you not to trouble yourself further, Mr. Director. I quite agree with you that this is a misplaced joke, but it was my duty to come to you. With polite words he said goodbye to Gesh and left the building. As soon as Inspector Baxter had gone, Gesh bade Raffles come to him. There is a traitor in our neighborhood, he said to Raffles, as he came into his room. The superintendent of police Baxter has just arrived to inform me that he had received word that Raffles had been appointed to our bank as operating. I presented the whole thing as a joke, and the inspector believed it. Raffles looked sharply at Gesh's face, for he suspected a new deception. That is impossible, he replied. No one can know who I am. One cannot even suspect it. I swear, however, that I speak the truth, cried Mr. Gesh, and you must carry out our plan this very night. It may be too late tomorrow. Excellent, replied Raffles. I have the keys, so all I have to do is open the safes and take the money. How many millions do we have in our custody? Gesh asked. 4 million. Raffles replied. Too bad, said Mr. Gesh, drumming hurriedly with his fingers on the desk. I had hoped that we would not have to carry out our plan until we had 6 million in the safes. These cursed letters to Inspector Baxter cost us 2 million. But we cannot wait, we are in danger. I feel no danger, replied Raffles. I am used to surprises. The first danger I learned from you, Mr. Gesh. I will carry out our plan tonight. I shall have an automobile waiting at the corner of the street at 4 o'clock in the morning, said Mr. Gesh. With that you can take the chest of money to my villa. All right, replied Raffles, so we'll see each other tomorrow. As soon as Raffles had left him, Mr. Gesh goes home, where he furiously enters Mackintosh's room. You're the biggest dumbass I've ever seen, he roared to his accomplice. The extent to which? Asked the other in a careless tone, drawing thick clouds of smoke from his cigar. You wrote 2 letters to Inspector Baxter about Raffles and betrayed our plan. Have you gone insane? Not at all, replied Mackintosh, with a mocking laugh, but you are not wise yourself to trust this Raffles. Don't meddle in my business, I repeat. You don't seem to know what you're doing. Certainly, mocked Mackintosh, I know very well what my plan is. I want to save our millions. A nice way, jeered Mr. Gesh. You have committed boundless stupidity. If I had not succeeded in reassuring the inspector and making the whole matter seem like a joke, I too should now have the pleasure of acquainting myself with the prison. I don't understand, said Mackintosh, rising. Would you like to explain that to me? Very easy, replied Mr. Gesh. If the inspector had imprisoned Raffles on account of your letter, he would, of course, have made me the main culprit. I didn't think of that, muttered Mackintosh, but you could have denied it. To deny? Cried Mr. Gesh. I could have denied. Raffles carries in his shirt pocket a writing of my hand, which he allowed me to give to him for the sake of security. What scripture? Asked Mackintosh, worried. A statement, replied Mr. Gesh, in which I confessed to instructing Raffles to take the millions of deposits from the bank and share them with me. You truly are the greatest fool there is, cried Mackintosh exclaims. Where was your mind, of which you always boast? How could you give that man such writing? He demanded it, and I trusted him. You'll see how disappointed you are, said Mackintosh. I think our whole plan has fallen into the water. You make me nervous, said Mr. Gesh, but I cannot believe your words. I can suffer, replied Mackintosh. When will the theft take place? Already last night, said Mr. Gesh in response. All right, said Mackintosh, tomorrow you will have lost the millions. At the same time, Raffles was with Mr. Brand in his office busy closing hundreds of city letters in cover. They bore the addresses of the Lincoln Bank depositors, the contents of the letters written by Charlie Brand being identical. It was close to 10 o'clock in the evening when Raffles, accompanied by his friend and secretary, made his way to the Lincoln Bank. The night shift officer looked up in surprise when both requested entry. He, however, recognized the chief clerk of the bank and without suspicion opened the door of the heavy iron gate and the gate behind it. Raffles and Charlie Brand entered the vestibule. There was dead silence in the great building. The night porter, an old former soldier, asked Raffles to enlighten him on the steps with his chest-mounted lantern. When they reached Raffles's room, the porter felt suddenly seized from both sides, and before he could scream he was handcuffed. Dead pale with fright, he looked at the presumed procurator and his comrade, and with trembling lips he whispered, "Spare my life, gentlemen." "We will harm you," replied Raffles, "if you keep quiet. I'm sorry to be unpleasant to you, but it's inevitable. I must put a gag in your mouth so that you do not scream. Just open your mouth." The night porter obeyed helplessly, paralyzed with terror, and Raffles gagged him. Now he took the keys to the building from him, including his lantern, and went with Charlie Brand to the steel, subterranean treasuries. It was a trifle for Raffles to open the heavily armored door and take the millions out of the safes. It was Bank of England bills of money, and no one would have guessed that the package, no larger than an ordinary suitcase, contained millions. Raffles carried away the millions in a simple wooden box. Undisturbed, he left the building with Charlie Brand, closed the door, and made his way to Oxford Street. He and his friend were already a few hundred yards from the bank building when he spoke to Charlie. "I hear someone is following us. Let us walk more slowly, and as soon as we hear footsteps behind us, we must suddenly turn to see who is following us." Slowly he and Charlie moved on, and clearly behind their backs they heard the hurried steps of a man. He was still a few yards from them when Raffles turned suddenly, dropped the box of banknotes to the ground in the next instant, and with a dexterous leap seized the man by the throat, who was just about to, with his dagger raised to stab Raffles. A heavy blow from the great unknown struck the man in the temple, so that he fell down without a sound. "There he lies like a flour sack," said Raffles, taking the weapon from the unconscious man. "The fellow looks familiar," said Charlie. "Certainly," laughed Raffles, "it is our old friend whom we left bound on the rocky island. He escaped. A brave fellow. Now I'd like to know how that man found out about our plan against the Lincoln Bank, and what relation he has to Mr. Gesh. He must have something to do with him. I suspected at once that he was a tool of that villainous Gesh, and that the fellow was trying to get rid of me. Well, I'll get it tomorrow from Mr. Get to know Gesh personally. Let us move on." They took up the chest with the valuable papers again and, without further concern for the unconscious person, disappeared into the darkness of the night. About 4 o'clock in the morning, as Gesh had arranged with Raffles, the car appeared at the appointed place, but it waited in vain for Raffles. After waiting for an hour, the driver drove over and informed Mr. Gesh that the gentleman he was supposed to bring with him had not come. This news made the bank manager nervous. What could have happened? Would Mackintosh Wright and Raffles want to keep the loot alone? With a curse he ran into Mackintosh's room, but no one was there. While he was still thinking about the matter and wondering what could have happened, the door opened and Macintosh dragged himself into the room with difficulty. He looked terrible. His right eye was bloodshot, and the blow that Raffles had dealt him had caused a violent nosebleed, so that his overcoat was crusted with blood. His red hair hung disheveled over his forehead, and the dirt of the street clung all over his clothes. "What happened?" asked Gesh, the arm of Macintosh anxiously grasping. The wounded man sat down with difficulty, vomited a terrible curse, and cried. "That you belong in a madhouse is certain." "Where do you come from?" repeated Gesh. "From Raffles," replied Macintosh, "of that accursed villain. Look how he beat me up. For half an hour I have lain unconscious in Oxford Street, and the millions have perished." "Are you insane?" gasped Mr. Gesh. "What about the money then? I expect Raffles any moment." Macintosh burst into jeers. "I was right. A thief cannot be allowed to steal for himself. And I repeat, the millions are as sure as hell as I sit here before you. Find them where the pepper grows. You won't see a penny of it." Mr. Gesh had to sit down, his knees buckled, he began to tremble, and the whole room revolved with him. "Is it really true?" he whispered in a broken voice. "If I believed in God, I would swear to you in his name," said Macintosh. "Listen what happened to me. I wanted to save the money for us because I understood what would happen. I took my dagger and waited in front of the Lincoln Bank for this wretch and his friend to leave the building. Had he gone to the waiting car as agreed, I would have jumped next to the driver, whom I know well, and driven here. Then I would have made my mistake and everything would have been fine. But it turned out differently and exactly as I thought. Raffles did not turn left, but turned right into the street. Immediately I understood what I had to do. As quietly as I could I crept after the two into the shadows of the houses, wanting first Raffles and then his friend to thrust my dagger between the ribs. I would have succeeded, too, if Raffles had not had such protruding ears. While I was going to help him to the other world, he surprised me with an old trick known to detectives. He turned and knocked me down with a mighty blow. I don't know what happened next. One thing is certain though, he didn't come here with his millions. The devil fetched the dog." The bank manager's face had turned pale. He understood that he had been cheated. His thoughts raced through his brain like petrels and he knew no way out how to get back the stolen millions. "The game is lost," said Macintosh, who dabbed his face with water. "If you'd followed my advice and handed the fellow over to the police, I'd have gotten the money tonight and we'd be rich. If I didn't have to thank you, I would beat you to death for your boundless stupidity. The only advice I can give you is that you go to the bank first thing in the morning, inform Scotland Yard, and try to recover Raffles and his loot." That was the last straw for Mr. Gesh, to which he could cling, and the only hope left to him. When he was about to leave the room, Macintosh. "I think it would be best if we left London. Let the devil know how this story ends." Chapter 6. Cheated. It was about 9 o'clock in the morning of the following day when a large crowd gathered in Balfour Street. The police were called in and they struggled to restore order. All who were present, men and women, people of all ranks, held envelopes in their hands, and one showed the other his letter. Half an hour later the door of the little house was opened, and Charlie Brand, who stood on the threshold, kept order in the encroaching crowd. "Slowly," he cried, "slow down, people. One by one. You will all get your money back, no one will lose a penny." The first he let an old woman in. The house seemed uninhabited and only one room on the ground floor was in use. Behind a large table, which was full of money, sat Raffles, the great unknown. Before him lay the great deposit book of the Lincoln Bank. "What's your name?" he asked the old mother. "Jenny Gross," she replied in a trembling voice. "How big is your credit?" £70 sterling, sir. I've saved for it for 30 years. It would be later for my funeral. I don't want to be buried by the poor." Raffles opened the book to make sure the information was correct. Then he filled out a form, paid her the £70 and said, "Sign this receipt." With trembling fingers the old woman did as Raffles desired, stroked the money affectionately, put it in an old purse, and spoke with tears of joy in her eyes. "May heaven repay you for saving my savings." When the old woman came out she was surrounded by the crowd and stormed with questions as to whether she had gotten her money back. When she confirmed this, the bystanders exhaled with relief. Their faces brightened and one by one they entered the house, where Raffles paid them back their due. Lister had not yet paid out half of the money deposited when extra tidings were distributed by the newsboys. "Theft of $1 million from the Lincoln Bank," they shouted. The waiting crowd in front of the house was terrified on hearing this report. That was their money stolen there, their hard-earned savings. And a stranger gave it back to them. The payment had been going on for an hour, and latecomers still turned up, carrying the mysterious letter from Raffles. Journalists and detectives also came to take a look, full of curiosity. They had been given the strange story that the millions stolen that night from the Lincoln Bank were being repaid by a stranger in Balfour Street. But the journalists and detectives tried in vain to enter the house. Charlie Brand refused entry to anyone who could not prove that he was a creditor of the bank. At the same time, Mr. Gesh rushed to the Lincoln Bank and found his officials, who had already discovered the theft, in the greatest agitation. The night porter had been found tied up in the chief clerk's room and the man had said that he had been attacked first. As if a bomb had exploded at Inspector Baxter's feet, he was appalled when he received the message. "Raffles," he groaned, "Raffles. This trick of his will cost me my dismissal. That man drives me insane. I had only had to hold out my hand to arrest him, and instead." He hurried to the Lincoln Bank with a dozen officials and met Mr. Gesh. It was completely broken and sat blankly in his desk. He looked as white as chalk. "Where does the procurator live?" asked Inspector Baxter, entering. "In Ashbury Park," replied Mr. Gesh softly. "I already sent a message to his house, but he was not there." "That is understandable," replied Baxter. "That would be very stupid of him. On what recommendation did you take this man into your service?" "He showed me excellent credentials," lied Mr. Gesh. "He put up a fair surety, too." "Did he leave it?" asked Inspector Baxter. "No," replied Mr. Gesh. "He took everything and left nothing behind." "A strange thing," said the official thoughtfully, "a very strange thing indeed. This is the first time that a bank's attorney in fact has done something like that." "Yes. It's unheard of," muttered Mr. Gesh. "How will you now meet your obligations to the creditors? Have you ever thought about that?" Baxter asked. "No," replied Mr. Gesh. "We are unable to repay people their money. I feel sorry for those poor people. I'm surprised no one has been there yet. When I came here I was already shouted that the millions of the Lincoln Bank had been stolen. Well, then, I shall leave a sufficient number of constables here for your protection, lest the excited mob beat everything to pieces. I already experienced something similar once and I will never forget it. The lazy are like insane. It is also sad when someone has saved a small amount of money with great difficulty, and it is stolen from him by a crook." At this moment Mahome hurried into the room exclaiming, Mr. Director, I have to tell you something unbelievable. Detective Schultz is just there to inform me that the Lincoln Bank's millions are being paid out." "Are you mad?" asked Inspector Baxter. "I hope not," replied Mahome. "Raffles," supported Mr. Gesh. That name worked like a lightning bolt on both police officers. "What do you say?" asked Baxter, closing in on him. "I suspect it was Raffles who stole the millions." "Yesterday you scoffed at it," said Inspector Baxter, "and to your satisfaction I can tell you that my secretary Mahome felt the same as you do. So it turns out that Mr. John Govan is one and the same person as the master thief we are looking for. Have Detective Schultz come in." Detective Mahome brought in his colleague, a German by birth, and Inspector Baxter again had him tell the wonderful story about the payment of the money in Balfour Street. When the detective had finished his story, Baxter spoke. "It's 12 o'clock already, and the newspaper boys have been shouting their reports of the theft of the millions for an hour, but none of the depositors appear at the bank to claim their money. So the case must indeed be true. Let us go to Balfour Street." He turned to Mr. Gesh, preparing to leave the office, said, "I think you have an interest in investigating this strange matter further. I hope you will come with us." "Of course," said Mr. Gesh, "I'm going with you." The police inspector left with several officers and Mr. Gesh, to go to the Balfour Street. From afar he saw a large crowd of people standing around the building. It was only with difficulty that he and his companions made their way to the house. When the inspector came to the door, Charlie Brand personally led him to the room where Raffles stood and was busy paying off the last creditor. "There's Raffles," said Mr. Gesh, pointing his hand at the great unknown. "Arrest him, my lord inspector." Raffles stood by the table in an elegant company toilet with his left hand in his trouser pocket, his inseparable cigarette in his right hand. He smiled mockingly when Mr. Gesh saw enter and gave a polite bow to Detective Inspector Baxter and Detective Mahone. Charlie Brand watched the scene with tense interest, standing between Raffles and the incoming crowd. "Good day, sir," cried Raffles, "I've been waiting for you." Baxter paused hesitantly when he saw Raffles, and the detectives hardly dared enter either. They thought that Raffles would fire a revolver at them. "Be unconcerned, gentlemen," cried Raffles, noticing their fear. "I already told you I had been expecting you." "That is the greatest insolence I have ever experienced," exclaimed Mr. Go. "This fellow dares mock us. Put the handcuffs on him, my lord inspector, and count yourself lucky that you have succeeded at last in disposing of this dangerous creature." Raffles laughed as he knocked the ash off his cigarette. Then he continued calmly. "You are right, Mr. Gesh, if you apply the words you have just spoken, not to me, but to yourself." Mr. Gesh paled. Raffles observed this, as did Inspector Baxter, and as the latter well knew that the great unknown sought his victims only among glassy and top-hatted thugs, he eagerly awaited the answer of the accused. "Don't allow yourself rudeness," called Mr. Gesh, furious, his face turning blue-red. Motionless as a marble statue, Raffles looked at the bank manager, threw away the remainder of his cigarette, leisurely lit a fresh one and replied, "I must explain to the inspector who you are. Take a good look at that man, Mr. Baxter. 10 years ago he cheated me, so that I lost all my wealth. £4.5 million sterling. Is that right?" He turned to Gesh. He shook his head in denial. "A lie, gentlemen. A lie. The fellow is lying, I don't know him." Raffles reached into his shirt pocket and produced a document signed by Mr. Gesh. "Perhaps this is also a forgery?" he asked. "Yes," gasped the bank manager. "Yes, sure. I don't know what that is, I never signed that document." "Listen, Sir Inspector, to what this letter is. I hereby declare that I appoint Lord Edward Lister to the Lincoln Bank and order him to take from the safes the funds held by the bank and to divide them with me. Charles Gesh, calling himself Stein." Raffles had read the contents of the document in a clear and slow voice, and was now handing it over to the superintendent of police. Mr. Gesh leaned as pale as a corpse against the wall. His knees buckled, for he understood that he had lost the game. Inspector Baxter had read the piece and spoke to Raffles in surprise. "However, why did you steal the funds deposited with the bank?" "I had to," replied Raffles, "or else this fellow would have done it with an accomplice of his and the millions would have been gone forever. As you see, Sir Inspector, I took the funds only for the purpose of returning them to their rightful owners. I hereby deliver to you the receipts of the people who had entrusted their money to this scoundrel, as well as the books of the bank. My job is done, I stole the millions for a good cause. Farewell." In a flash Raffles turned to a door behind him, opened it, and ere any of those present could prevent him, he had closed and bolted the door behind him and was gone. "Hold the criminal," called Mr. Gesh. "Hell yes," said Baxter, "we'll hold him. In the name of English law, I take you into custody, Mr. Gesh, calling you Stein. The criminal is you and not Raffles." Baxter beckoned the detectives to handcuff Gesh. But before they could extend a hand to the imposter, the latter produced a revolver, put it to his forehead, a shot rang out and the bank manager fell dead. For a few seconds they all stared at each other in terror, then Baxter, who had recovered first, spoke. "Let the corpse be judged. He is dead and has paid for his crime." Charlie Brand had taken advantage of the general consternation by leaving the room unnoticed. No one noticed him, and an hour later, as he had arranged with Raffles, he was sitting in his study, where he told his friend the tragic death of the bank manager. Long reports of this case were in the evening papers and the Times wrote that it was time to erect a statue to John Raffles. Hundreds of little folks, for whom he had stolen the savings to save them from the clutches of a villain, blessed him. Mackintosh sat alone, filled with hatred, in his accomplice's villa, and pondered how he might recover his treasure, which Raffles had taken from the island. Learn from the newspapers of Mr. Gesh, and as he was in possession of a will in which Mr. Gesh had named him heir to his entire estate, he could consider himself the owner of the villa. But he didn't have a penny of cash. He was not even able to feed his servants. Mackintosh, however, sold some precious paintings, paid his servants and fired them. He employed only the driver. He knew from days gone by a thug's tavern, on the Strand, whose owner, an Irishman, was an old schoolmate of his. He went to look for these. "Tom," he said to the tall, well-built man who stood behind his counter, tapping the most adulterated brandy in all London for his customers, "Tom, you must help me." The proprietor of the pub, hearing this voice, looked sharply at his visitor and replied, "By Saint Patrick! Pat Jimmy, is it you?" Pat Jimmy used to be Mackintosh's crook in earlier years. "As you see," he replied. "For the devil, who cut you loose when you hung on the gallows?" Tom asked. "Did the birds carry you through the air? I myself read in the papers that you were to be hanged, and on the morning when you were over we drank a tall glass of brandy of my best kind to your health. Have you risen from the dead? That is at St. Patrick, a very rare occurrence." "Not so curious as you think," said Mackintosh laughing. "The snare I hung on was good, but they had beaten up the gallows a little too quickly. When they pulled the plank from under my feet to send me to eternity, I fell into a pit, but the whole gallows fell down with me. You know my throat doesn't leave much to be desired. I was then pardoned, because under English law no one may be hanged twice. I was sent to Australia to keep the streets and roads tidy. A devilish joke, when one has to drag a chain with a bullet on one's leg, while the sun burns on your head so that your brain almost melts." "And how did you get out of that frying pan again?" asked Tom, pouring his old friend another glass of brandy. Mackintosh drained the vile stuff in a single gulp and spoke with a dirty face. "Give me something better to drink first. Hanging on the gallows is still wonderful, compared to this bend. That hurts the throat more than a noose." "Be glad you can still drink my brandy," growled Tom. "But here I have an extra good brand, which I only give on holidays. I'll just think your visit is a holiday for me. Drink and then tell me how you came out of that furnace." He poured another glass, which Mackintosh investigatively tasted. "This is better. You should have thought of a holiday right away. Now then listen. I happened to find a file on the road where I worked, and with it I freed myself. It was a miserable, corroded instrument. But in distress the devil eats flies. Every night I filed under my blanket on the chain. A damned hard job. It took me 2 months to file through the iron band. Then I was free. I knocked down a keeper who was mad enough to block my way with a single blow, took his rifle from him, and fled into the woods. The mounted police chased me. Hell, Tom, I wouldn't have lasted a second time. Without water, without bread, I wandered in the wilderness for several weeks, until I succeeded in finding an old comrade as my owner. He took pity on me and hid me from the sniffer dogs. With him I have now come back to England, and because the man would not listen to my advice, he has fared badly and Scotland Yard took him as a corpse yesterday." Not, Tom hesitated. "Yes, of course," said Mackintosh. "The same one you mean. Is it possible? Mr. Gesh calling himself Stein, formerly known as Dick a Leg?" "Yes, the same. Damned, fat leg, who used to be a cashier at a great bank, you know. Well, the fellow had quite a record of sin, I assure you." "I believe so," said the innkeeper. "It's a shame about the fellow," said Mackintosh. "He had good plans, and if the damned Raffles hadn't beaten us this time, I'd be in millions now, and I wouldn't have to drink your bad brandy. You seem to have become a very distinguished gentleman. After all, I'm not asking you to drink my drinks." "That's right," muttered Mackintosh. "Surely you have a purpose for coming?" inquired Tom. "Fill my glass again with that good kind, and we'll talk. I think you will understand me and participate. But here I can't tell you. Surely you have another room?" Tom refilled the glass and led his visitor into a room behind the common room. "Well, what's on your mind?" asked Tom, after they had both taken their places in the cluttered room. Mackintosh first checked to see if anyone could overhear their conversation. "It is safe here," said the innkeeper, "don't worry." Mackintosh leaned over and whispered, "Would you like to be a rich fellow?" "I don't know why not," answered Tom. "Famine is no fun." All right, went Macintosh whispers on, I know a business that will make millions. You can hear it, answered Tom eagerly. A murder? If necessary, yes. It's not easy, said the Irishman, lighting a cigar. I don't like murders. It is too noisy. You weren't like that before, sneered Macintosh. I'll send you a nanny. Tell me what it is. If I have to, I always break another head in half. You know me. I studied to be a butcher. They put their heads together and Macintosh began. You remember that 12 years ago I saw old banker Burns? Yes, I know. You don't have to repeat that. That's why you would be hanged. It's been a bad history for you. If this thing is not very well put together, take someone else with you rather than me, because I thank you for such ties. If there's any killing to be done, I'll take care of it, replied Macintosh, and I hope it will go without making red soup. Beautiful, said Tom, with a broad grin. Go on, fellow. I then, continued Macintosh, stole $1.5 million from the old banker and had buried the papers and money on a small island near Iceland. A fine place, laughed Tom. The finest sleuths of Scotland Yard don't go looking for their pennies there. No, that speaks, replied Macintosh, refilling the glasses. After they had drunk, he continued. I never thought anyone would succeed in finding the pennies, but he banged his fist on the table. Let the devil get that dog. Who? Raffles. The biggest thief of this century. Raffles has succeeded in finding the booty. Now Tom also banged his fist on the table, so that the glasses clinked, and he exclaimed. Curse, Pat Jimmy, what are you saying? Raffles, the great unknown, has played you a trick? Yes, cried Macintosh, his eyes flashing with rage. By boundless stupidity of mine he succeeded. Tom laughed. Guys, you are stupid. You risk your life and steal and let Raffles take it away. That's a joke for a humorous album. You hang on the gallows and he stands there smoking a Havana he bought with the money that brought you to the gallows. Dude, that's too silly. How was that possible? Don't ask, said Macintosh. I'm telling you I've done a stupid thing and now you have to help me get everything back. If possible, please, said Tom. I'm curious how you plan to do that. You would be the first who managed to play a prank on Raffles. I think it will work, said Macintosh in a reassuring tone. Listen. I shall find out tonight how Raffles' house is built. Tom looked up in surprise. Do you know where the dog lives? That's worth £5,000, paid out in reward. We must have more than £5,000. I completely agree with you, if possible. But how is it possible that you know where he lives? All of Scotland Yard don't know. I learned that from my comrade, and my plan was built upon it. I suppose everything you say is true. How do you intend to handle the matter? It certainly won't be easy. That depends on you, replied Macintosh. The main thing is that I have a lot of help. Because alone I don't believe I'll get ready with Raffles. Very well, said Tom, when you have made up your plan, come to me. I'll help you. But share fairly. It goes without saying, said Macintosh replied, or do you take me for an imposter? I hope you are not one. There's my hand. It won't be up to me to get the job done. Was arranging the newspaper clippings of reports of his deeds, when he heard a rustle at the great glass door leading into the garden. He did not draw Charlie Brand's attention to it, but stood up and spoke indifferently. Come on, let's leave work until tomorrow and go to a restaurant. As you please, replied the secretary willingly, and they left the house together. They did not return until midnight. Charlie was surprised to see that Raffles did not use the usual entrance, but walked round the villa to the other part of the house. The moon cast down its faint rays, but for Raffles' sharp eyes this light was sufficient. Like an Indian he stooped along the paths, which he had every day carefully raked by the servant. Every footstep left its mark. Raffles soon found what he was looking for. He pointed with his hand to the clear marks of great men's boots. Keep calm, he whispered to Charlie, we have visitors in the house at night. He examined the footsteps further and stopped again a few yards away. They are with them both, he said. Here I discover other traces. These feet are smaller than the others. Who can it be? Charlie whispered curiously. I think, an old acquaintance, replied Raffles. If I am not greatly mistaken, it is Mr. Gesh's accomplice. Aha, whispered Charlie, The fellow will try to get back his treasures we took from the island. Right, and I think I'll be able to make a fool of him. He's stupid enough to come visit me. Now you go to the street door and enter the house with a lot of noise. The villains need to hear that you're coming home. Of course they will think it's me. Go to my study, take a revolver in case of emergency and wait for me there." Charlie Brand left, while Raffles, following the footsteps, crept up to the house. He entered the house by the same route that the burglars had taken, and it was done so inaudibly, as if a shadow slipped through the window into the library. Lord Lister had turned up the collar of his coat and tied a handkerchief over his face. Only his eyes could be seen, they sparkled like stars. As soon as he entered the room, he stood shyly, as if he were a burglar, and listened for a few moments. Like a thief he then crept forward until he stood in the middle of the room. Now he let the thief's lantern he carried in his pocket shed its light and drew his pistol. With keen eyes he discovered, by the light of the lantern, on the carpet that covered the entire floor, the traces of the burglar's wet shoes. They crossed the room to a velvet curtain that closed off a bay window, behind which the men had probably been hiding. A slight movement of the curtain showed Raffles that he had not been mistaken and that the men were watching him. He extinguished the lantern, and a satisfied smile played on his mouth. Softly he crept back to the window, opened it, and sounded a soft criminal whistle, such as is used in East End. Then he waited a few seconds and called clearly out of the window, as if he were speaking to someone in crooked language. "Everything is kosher. All right, no one to see. I'll throw it out the window." It was soft, but spoken so clearly that the men behind the curtain had to hear it. Now Raffles crept back across the room, where he stopped before a large oak cupboard. On it stood heavy silver candlesticks and vases. Raffles climbed onto a chair, lit his lamp and took the silver objects from their places. Now he set the lantern on the table and examined the silverware of the various pieces. "Good luck," he said aloud, and went to the window with his loot. Again he whistled and said, "Hey Jim, take it, I value them at £10. "Very good." He threw the silver candlesticks and ewes out of the window, and with a loud crash they fell to the floor. Immediately he put out the light again and, as if afraid of being caught by the noise, crawled under the table. After a few seconds he reappeared and, running to the window, cried, "Now I'll search the other rooms, and when everything's kosher, you and Jack will come in." Now Raffles crept into the study, where Charlie Brand had meanwhile entered. Charlie Brand was startled when Raffles, whom he did not at once recognize, suddenly stood in the room and spoke hurriedly to him. "Get out quickly. Tie a handkerchief over your face as I did and come in through the same window. You have to play burglar." Now Raffles crept back to the library, and with a glance convinced himself that the intruders unknown to him were still hidden behind the curtain. Again he went to the window and opened it. When he looked outside, he saw Charlie Brand. "Hey, Jim," cried Raffles, "I've looked everywhere. There are 2 gentlemen in the house. Both sleep. Now we can clear the rooms. You, Jim, must come here and Jack will keep watch and watch." With these words he helped Charlie Brand climb through the window and together they crept into the adjoining room. When they were some rooms away from the library, Raffles spoke with a sweet smile. "Now comes the biggest joke I have ever experienced in my life. The guys are standing behind the curtain in the bay window and are sweating blood because their colleagues are busy. Now we will take the silverware from the dining room and throw it out the window into the garden as well. Then we return, you take a police coat from my dressing room, put on a helmet and act as an officer." Both took an armful of silver dishes and plates and carried them all to the library. "Hey Jack!" cried Raffles from the window, "look out." In the next moment he threw out the silver objects and Charlie followed suit. "Devilish!" cursed Charlie. "Not so much noise, we're not at home here." "Don't worry," replied Raffles, "the gentlemen are fast asleep. Now we're going to get the rest and then off we go." They quickly went to the locker room and now Raffles hastily dressed his friend as a police officer. He then laid out for himself a second uniform and helmet, without putting them on. He gave Charlie Brand a revolver and a pair of handcuffs and spoke to him, entering the dining room. "Now you are a policeman and you are chasing me. You stand by the window of the library until I come back to you as a police officer. Don't let the guys out. Be strong, my boy. You must stand by the window of the library until I give you a signal." Then he took the silver that was on the sideboard, threw it on the floor with a great noise, and commanded in a loud voice, so that it echoed through all the rooms. "Stand still. Hands up," as he fired his revolver twice. Then he whispered to Charlie Brand, "Scream as if you were a police officer and follow me." As if fleeing, Raffles now rushed through the rooms to the library, overturning chairs and tables on his way. When he reached the library window, he shouted out, "Flee, Jack. The police raided us." They shot Jim. With that he jumped out of the window and disappeared into the darkness. In the next moment Charlie Brand, disguised as a police officer, rushed into the library and shouted aloud, "Halt!" He went to the window and cursed in a furious tone. "Accursed! The villain has fled, and that earns me a scolding from the inspector." He closed the window and, to pass the time until Raffles returned, turned on the electric light in the room and began to search everything. "Aha!" he exclaimed, "they have taken the silver from the cupboard." Then he went to the door and cried, as if he were speaking to someone, "Captain, the fellow has fled." "No," cried Raffles, who for this short time had disguised himself as a police inspector. "We have surrounded the whole house, no one can escape." Shortly after he had spoken these words, he entered the library and said, "We will search everything. It must be a whole gang. Keep revolvers ready." No sooner had he spoken these words than from behind the velvet curtain came Macintosh and Tom emerge, attempting to flee through the window. "Halt!" cried Raffles, holding out his revolver. "Here we have two thugs of the band." Fearing the uniforms and the revolvers aimed at them, the two villains surrendered unopposed. Raffles handcuffed them. "Best Scotland Yard bracelets," he jested, "made of excellent Dublin steel. And now forward." He grabbed Macintosh by the arm, while Charlie Brand grabbed Tom's wrists. They then took the two out onto the street. When they were outside, Tom said, "Do you know, Inspector, that you could have made a better catch in the house than to take us with you?" "I don't think so," replied Raffles. "But I do," said Tom. "In that house lives Raffles, the master thief whom you have sought so long." "You are crazy, fellow," laughed Raffles. "In that house lives the elder Professor Morton, whom I know very well. And now shut up." Then Tom, with a furious look at Macintosh, "I told you at once that you must be mistaken. Now you take me to Scotland Yard for the sake of an old professor." Macintosh gritted his teeth. Gesh must have lied to him, or Raffles would have told Gesh something. The game was lost. When they reached the nearest police station, they halted. Raffles turned his captives over to the officials. "I've been on a burglar hunt for Scotland Yard. Take a note from me. Take these men to Inspector Baxter. Be careful, they are strong guys." He tore a sheet of paper from his notebook and wrote a note. He closed it in an envelope and gave it to one of the officers, who put it in his pocket. "Use the guns at once," cried Raffles to the retreating men, "when you see the boys wanting to run." Half an hour later, much to Inspector Baxter's astonishment, the two prisoners were brought in to him. Baxter opened his colleague's note and read, "Inspector Baxter, I had to represent you. I am sending you as a result of my work these two burglars. You will find in one a long-sought, old acquaintance. He was the accomplice of our friend Mr. Gesh. Greetings from colleagues. Raffles." "What?" laughed Mahome. "Is Raffles sending those two?" "Yes," replied Baxter, "Raffles." When Macintosh hearing this he went almost insane with rage and roared like a man possessed. Raffles, however, sat in his cozy study and amused himself over his latest work, while Charlie Brand put the silver back in its place and noted with glee that it had received some dents. The next episode, number 26, contains Inspector Baxter at the Insane Asylum. Thank you for listening to today's episode. I really hoped you enjoyed it. There will be more to come. Please subscribe not to miss out on what is next. I will be looking forward to your return. The music is by Madfan from Pixabay. To support this and other artists, go to pixabay.com. Sheila.